so I can't. The book. I promised the bookstore I would wait. Okay, so now you're supposed to see, this is marketing in the extreme. Go get the book. It's a memoir. That's because I've never written anything like this. I've written too many books, lots of books. And I've never written anything like this. And I didn't really want to write this, to be honest with you. It just isn't my cup of tea, so to speak. I like reading them, but the idea of writing one was awful. But people persisted in saying that they thought that the stories I told and the connections I would make from the stories would be worth setting down on paper, so I tried it. And the title tells you something about what it is. It's not a history book, a definitive history of the period or something. I couldn't do that. I just don't have the skill or the knowledge to do that. It's not a biography. It is very much not about me. Instead, it's remembering, that is to say, looking at the past from the 60s to now, with the purpose of aiding the effort to reach a better tomorrow. And everything in here is conceived that way. In essence, I'm writing about things that I've written about in other ways, using personal experiences and proximity to events and occurrences and movements and people, and talking about them and the feelings and the emotions and the thoughts and the practices to try and discern lessons that might help us in getting to the future. One thing's for sure is we need to discern some lessons that might help us get to the future, because we're not winning. We've won a lot. What's incredible is that we've won anything, to make it honest. And it's incredible that we've won anything, not because the other side is so powerful. That's not the problem. The problem is that we're not very good at what we're doing. And we haven't been for 40 years. And despite that we're not very good, and despite that we weren't very good in the 60s, we had massive impacts on this society. That's actually good news. And all the flaws that we have, some of you are going to get depressed. Some of you might be offended by some of the flaws that I'll bring up. You shouldn't be. I don't understand that response. If we looked back and all we could find was exemplary behavior, perfect comprehension, ideal behavior, just wonderfulness, we'd be in deep trouble. Because it would mean that going forward, we couldn't ourselves do any better. And the only way that we would succeed would be if the other side faltered, and they're not going to. So the fact that we have flaws to uncover and to do better than them, to improve and to correct, is actually very good news, except for some of us who were participants all that time, and it gets depressing enumerating all of our inadequacies. But nonetheless, I'm going to do some of that. One way to start, this is a group of people, well, here's a way to say it. In 1969 and 1970, when we would be in a room like this, and there would be a few hundred people, more than this maybe, if the door opened at the back, and somebody walked in, and the person was over 40, maybe even over 30, it was like a lift for everybody in the room. You wanted to applaud, and maybe you did applaud. If you look around, you'll see that we've gone in the opposite extreme. Now the situation is, if somebody enters the room who's under 40, it's a lift, and we want to applaud. And that's this is clearly not good. And we can't blame it. Now comes the hard part. We can't blame it on the people who are under 40. We have to blame it on ourselves. It's my fault, and it's your fault. And so we have to figure out why that happened and what it is that causes people to do this, or to have these reactions to the left. I think there are some prime things, and then there are lots of other things, and I'm going to talk about a couple of the prime things. And then I think this audience is a very progressive and engaged and knowledgeable audience, and it might be more productive if we have a longer discussion period. When you ask a question, I'll go on at some length. But nonetheless, we'll be talking about what you want to talk about instead of what I want to talk about. But in any case, let me start with this. It's 1995, and I'm sitting on a panel at a green convention. And honestly, I don't remember who else was on the panel, and even at the time, I was paying no attention. I was nodding off. I must be honest. It wasn't holding my attention, and I was sort of daydreaming, waiting my turn to bore everybody. And I suddenly had a kind of a revelation, I guess. Revelation? No. What's the word? Yeah, sort of an epiphany. I don't want to go overboard. But for me it was. And this is what it was. I said to myself, maybe it was in 1995, so we're talking 30 years from 1965. And I said to myself, in the 30 years from 1965, how many people in the United States have come into the vicinity of the left? Or deeply into it, but at least into the vicinity of the left. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about everybody who was involved in any of the dimensions of the 60s, right? The civil rights movement, anti-Vietnam War movement, all that stuff. Anybody who was involved in the no nukes movement, huge. Anybody who was involved in the gay and lesbian movement, anybody who was involved in the feminist movement, anybody in the labor movement, or at least swaths of the labor movement. Anybody who took a course from a radical, anybody who came into the vicinity of radical. And I decided a very, very, very conservative number was 10 million, right? If you think about it, you'll see that makes sense, not least because on one day in the 60s, there were 4 million people in the streets in the United States, literally in the streets. So 10 million is a very low number, but let's use that number. And then I thought to myself, we're supposed to be the humane people. We're supposed to be the caring people. We're supposed to be the people that are about a better future. Shouldn't it be the case that when somebody gets into the vicinity of our efforts, of our movements, they're attracted? They're drawn to it like gravity, and they become ever more involved, ever more committed, ever more conscious. Shouldn't that be the case? Clearly it should, right? If that isn't the case, there's a problem. And then I looked and said to myself, well, you know what, there's a problem. Because clearly that isn't the case. Where are they, right? If the 10 million people were drawn in by the virtues of the left, then not only would they be in the movement in 1995, but all the people who they would have organized while they were in the movement for that time, all the people who they would have affected and inspired would be in the movement. And in 1995, we'd have what, 30 million, 40 million, 50 million people who identified as being left, as being critical of capitalism, maybe isn't as being for something positive. That's not enough to win. I'll repeat that. That's not enough to win. If we're about winning, we're talking about a movement with 100 million self-conscious, organized people in the United States. But 40, 50, 60 million people would be a different world, vastly better, and really on the road to winning a new society. Now, why didn't we have that? After the 30 years, why didn't we have it? This isn't an outreach problem. We definitely have an outreach problem. It's hard to reach out to people in this society because we don't have the tools to do it. But we had reached 10 million, very conservatively. And that's enough if we had stickiness. If our movements, retained people, that would be enough for them to have reached the few additional ones to have massive support in the United States. And so the question arises, what's the stickiness problem? Why don't people stick? What is it about our movement that causes people to bounce off, to come in the vicinity and not stay? So I thought about it, sitting there, almost falling off the table that I was on. For me, it was a real it was a shocking thought. And I thought to myself, well, okay, so then what is it? And I thought it was a number of things. Some of it is easy to see. Come join me in the movement. Risk your relationship with your parents. Risk your relationship with your friends. Forget about watching TV anymore, except for The Simpsons. If you watch anything else, you're going to get denigrated and looked down on and not be a part of the community and so on. Watch your clothing from now on. Watch what you wear. Watch how you talk. Your sex life is going to go down the tubes. your personal friendships are going to diminish. Your career is in the toilet. And what do we give you? Long meetings. Do we give something else? Am I missing something? I mean, all right, I'm exaggerating a little, but not too much. And then we wonder, right, in general, why a sane person, instead of being retained, just bounces off. Right? It may well be that we're a little nuts. Right? When you get right down to it, and that's not a compliment. It's not a denigrating term. You know, it's not a criticism either. But in the real world, we have to deal with real people. So that was one set of reasons. The movement doesn't enrich people's lives. A movement that's desirable and that's going to win. I'm not in it. Maybe I should make this clear, to fight the good fight. Fuck that. I'm not interested in that. Fight the good fight means go play one-on-one basketball with Michael Jordan. Right? If you go play one-on-one basketball with Michael Jordan, you get your head handed to you. You lose. And you don't have to do a good job. You don't have to be responsible for figuring out what you've done that's good and what you've done that's bad and improving. Because no matter how much you improve, you lose. Pretty much by the same amount. So there's no point. Fight the good fight is a slogan I can't stand. Be on the side of the angels. I can't stand it. What these slogans say to people, and what our tone and manner often says to people, is that we don't really expect to get any place. We just do it because we want to be able to look at ourselves in the mirror. It's not bad to want to look at yourself in the mirror, but let's not make believe that that's about changing the world. That's about being able to look at yourself in the mirror, which is better than being disgusting. But it's not about changing the world. Changing the world involves being responsible and serious about trying to think through what it is we're doing and make it better, instead of just doing it over and over and over again, regardless of the results. So one set of reasons, which have to do with that list that I gave, is that the movement doesn't enrich people's lives. There is a group that understands this in the world. Muslim fundamentalists understand this. And so do right-wing fundamentalists in the United States. Both groups understand it really well. And they have grown precisely by not only taking advantage of it, but by creating it. The government in the United States, the government in Pakistan, destroy social programs, destroy welfare, destroy daycare, destroy aid, destroy places to congregate and socialize, destroy educational programs. And then the churches, whether we're talking Muslim fundamentalist or fundamentalist in the US, provide these services. And basically say to people, you want daycare? You want a place to play? You want a ball league? You want a dance? You want a way to socialize? You want a night school class? Sign on. Right? You just have to sign this thing that says that you think gays should be dead and abortion should be wiped out and so on and so forth. And people sort of sign on because that's so silly, and I'm at least going to get these services. And then after a while, they pretty much are sucked into the other stuff. Anyway, that's a sidebar. But the point is not that we should emulate them or copy them, but that a movement should make people's lives better. Right? A movement that's a good movement is going to have socializing functions in it, right? Social functions. It's going to have maybe athletic leagues. It's going to have reading groups. It's going to have things that will improve the quality of people's life. It's even going to think about how do you facilitate people meeting other people that they can have relationships with, right? It's going to think about that because people need that. And because you can't sustain activism against a behemoth if you don't have some of that. So that's one set of reasons that we could think about. But there's two others I want to address. One is, in that list of things, when I say, come join the movement and here's the problem, there's another problem. What do we want? Right? People join the movement and have no idea what the movement is aiming to win. Oh, everybody knows that we're aiming to win justice. Everybody knows that we're aiming to win equity. Everybody knows that we'd like solidarity. In other words, everybody knows a bunch of adjectives. Adjectives that Bill Clinton could get up here, give a speech about, right? be more emotive and compelling than I can, seem absolutely honest and compassionate, and maybe he even is. You know, maybe you couldn't detect it with a machine, right? And we would all laugh at it, and we would all say, it's ridiculous. Why would we say that? We would say that because we know that he supports a set of institutions that put the lie to the values, right? We don't just listen to those values. We know that it has to be more than that. Just saying you're for good things doesn't mean you are for good things if you're then for a set of institutions which obliterate the things that you have advocated. Is that clear? I mean, okay? So now look at us. We don't say what institutions we're for. They keep asking us over and over and over again, what do you want? What do you want? What do you want? And we reply, the world sucks, the world sucks, the world sucks. Right? It's not enough. If you stacked up all the descriptions of what's wrong with capitalism, what's wrong with patriarchy, what's wrong with racism, what's wrong with authoritarianism, what's wrong with foreign policy, and so on and so forth, and you stacked it up, it'd be huge, huge. It'd reach the damn moon. But if you stacked up our answers to the question, what do you want, that isn't just rhetoric, right, adjectives, but is something that would give people a feeling that a different way of living, a different way of organizing life was possible, it might reach my knee or my ankle. And yet, I think that's the big obstacle to participation. So, how many of you have seen the movie Shooter? It's just out. Your left audience, of course, nobody has seen it. It's a popular thriller movie. Mark Wahlberg is the star. Interestingly enough, very early in the movie, I mean, really near the beginning, he's a shooter, meaning he's a sniper. So you did see the movie, or you just could tell? Okay. Very early in the movie, he's got this computer screen, and it goes big on the movie screen, and it's focused on ZNet. Right? It's a gigantic Hollywood movie, and it's not like that. It sits there. And he says, you know, I'm getting my daily dose of discovering what they're lying about. And then the movie goes along, and the movie like much of what goes on the big screen now, and much of what goes on TV, and much of what goes into the top 10 sellers on you know, the bestsellers list, has all sorts of critique. It basically says, and not it basically says, it vehemently and vigorously says, you can't miss it, that our foreign policy is organized around enhancing the wealth and the power of the elites and oil in Iraq. So it's unequivocal about that. So, two things about this. If you show this movie in 1960 about Vietnam and saying that our motives there are to, you know, crush dissent and so on and so forth, the movie theater gets burned down. Right? If you show the movie now, everybody takes it for granted. What happened? And this now is part of the 60s thing. In the 60s burst onto the scene, not because all of a sudden everybody became, you know, I don't know how to put it, incredible revolutionaries, but because people got pissed at hypocrisy. Everybody thought that everything that was painful was personal, that our inadequacies and our suffering weren't crimes, they were just inadequacies. So the archetype of this is the women's movement, women sitting around and one after another describing their personal situation. And each one is describing a situation that she feels is basically, you know, a horror, but her horror, a function of, you know, the schnook that she's with, or the schnooks that she's encountered. But it's not something social, it's just, you know, except that they keep, whether it's talking about being denigrated, or it's talking about being ignored, or it's talking about being, you know, pedestalized, or it's talking about being roughed up, or made to do too much, or raped, the story goes around, and each one talks, and everybody hears that their situations are virtually identical. And that, you know, while it changes the faces, the structure of it is the same, and everybody gets angry and sees that there's something systemic about it. it's patriarchy, or it's sexism, and there's this bursting of anger at that. The same thing happened around poverty. Right? In this crowd, a lot of you will know Michael Harrington wrote a book about poverty. It's a revelation. There's poverty in America. And it isn't the fault of the poor. The black movement had a similar dynamic of throwing off feelings of inadequacy and developing feelings of anger at a systemic crime. The war was incredibly graphic on this score. We went from feeling the United States was the savior of the world to the United States was the scourge of the world. We got it right the second time. But we went, and it was very quick, and it was a revelation of facts, of evidence, to demonstrate that we were in the dark. And it wasn't that we just said corporations are trying to serve people, right? Not make profits for themselves, regardless of the effects on people. Doctors are trying to provide health care, not monopolize medical skills to increase their income, regardless of the effects on people. The US government is trying to enrich the world and spread them and all the rest of it. It wasn't just that people in 1960 said it as a sort of a posture. It was that people really believed it deep down. And when it was blown away, people got furious and you had the 60s. Okay, so that movie would have been burned down at the beginning, and then over time, a subset of people would believe it, and others would still not believe it. And when you organized then, you had to first overcome the confusion, the downright ignorance, the honest, not fake, honest ignorance of what was going on in the world, and what the purpose of what was going on in the world was, and what the roots of it were. Even early SDS, if you go back and look, you'll see it's about replacing racist Southern sheriffs with enlightened Southern sheriffs. It's about getting rid of bad politicians. It's about getting America back on track, right? That's what early SDS was all about. It wasn't about, uprooting the capitalist tentacles or something. That came later, not much later, we moved quickly, but that came later. Right. Even then, I would go around and organize, I was at MIT, a lot of this stuff is in here, of course, with stories and personal and so on. And I would go, we were, these were tumultuous times, and we had a large movement there, and it's a long story, but the point that I'm talking about, we did have a big movement, and I would go into a dorm to speak, sort of like this, go into some place to speak. Just a dorm, not the whole school. A dorm, and everybody in the dorm is there. Right? But the entire dorm is there to hear the talk. Why? Well, not because they're all leftists, but because we can shut down the school. We're as important as the administration is, right? And they want to know what's going on. So everybody is there, and we're talking about the war. And the first thing you have to do is dispel the myths and argue against the ignorance and provide endless facts. And you do it, and you do it, and you do it. And eventually you start to make progress. And then there's a foundation under that in some of the people. Some of the people get pissed, some of the people get angry, and some of the people get sort of passive and cynical and depressed, but not angry. And they say, if you can elicit it, but human nature sucks. People suck, right? You're asking us to do something stupid. So even in those days, there was both the fact problem, the ignorance problem, to be addressed with analysis of what's wrong. And then there was this other problem. This other problem being a kind of cynicism about the possibility of anything better. Now this isn't stupidity. Suppose I got up here and I gave the most compelling, gut-wrenching talk you ever heard. The facts were irrefutable. And I'm talking about a phenomenon, and the phenomenon, slowly but surely, diminishes our capacities, constrains our options, restricts what we can do, makes us feel worse, and kills us. And it kills more of us than poverty, it kills more of us than war, it even kills more of us than cancer or whatever you want. And it's completely irrefutable. And at the end of the talk, I say, Now come join me in a social movement against aging. I was completely right in all my facts, but what do you say to me? You say to me, go get a life. Grow up. Face reality. And there came a time when I began to realize that when everybody says to us, essentially, go get a life, grow up, face reality, they are reasoning in the same way. They're not defending elite interests. They are doing something that is logical, because to them, fighting against poverty, fighting against sexism, fighting against war is like fighting against aging or against gravity. We're asking them to blow into the wind, right? We're asking them to roll rocks up hills and get crushed when they come back down, in their eyes. So they think we should get a life. They think we should face reality. And what do we do to get them, to bring them? We talk more about how bad it is, which actually feeds what they already believe. You go to the doctor, and the doctor comes in, a little strong face, and says, I'm really sorry, but you're seriously sick. You take a deep breath, and the doctor starts to describe the horrendous symptoms that you're going to show in the coming months. After a while, it gets pretty depressing. And you say, okay, what can I do about it? What would health entail? And the doctor goes on for another 15 minutes with another bunch of horrible symptoms. And you say, okay, what can I do about it? What's going to be the good thing? Where is the health? And the doctor gives you 15 more minutes of horrendous symptoms. We're the doctor, and the American people are the patient in this analogy, right? And we keep saying, capitalism is grotesque. It manipulates us, all the stuff we say. And we say it over and over again. They say, what do you want? And we say, capitalism sucks. So the second problem is the vision problem. The first problem was the stickiness problem. The second problem is the vision problem. That is, for people who work 40, 50, 60 hours, to feel that it makes the remotest bit of sense to participate even in a good movement, much less in a movement that makes them feel horrible. They have to feel like what they're doing has a purpose, an aim, it's going someplace, and their contribution matters. And that's what we need to address. We need to address where we're going, why it's better, and why people giving time, right, moves us in that direction. Why it's worth the hour. That's what's needed, I think. So that's the second problem. The third problem I want to talk about is maybe a little more controversial here, I don't know. Let me use another example. It's 1970, I think it was. Again, a room like this, but not as fancy. Not this many people, a few more people, and we're talking about an anti-war rally, a demonstration, actually, a riot. So we're talking about the preparations for an event, an anti-war event, and it's open. That wasn't invented 10 years ago. We were doing it then. It's an open meeting, and we're talking about that. And all of a sudden, the door, I'm chairing, so I'm up in the front of the room. Just an accident of history. And there's a door in the back, and the door opens, and about 50 women march into the room and circle the front of the room. One of them looks at me and says, sit down. I'm not an idiot, I sat down. And they then said the following, roughly speaking. I can't do it verbatim, but the substance is the same. They said, this movement is sexist. In being sexist, it is both hypocritical and suicidal. It's hypocritical because it says it's for justice and it's for equity and it's for, a good world. And in fact, it's reproducing the very dynamics that kill us and that oppress us. So it's hypocritical. And it can't be good on gender. It can't be really good on gender if it's internally horrendously sexist. It's suicidal because it creates an environment that is disempowering to women and even uncongenial to women, and therefore women won't contribute at the scale that is needed if we're going to have a movement that's going to end war. So here's the outcome, they say. There's going to be no more anti-war movement in Vietnam, or there's going to be an anti-war movement that does the following. Every time there's a leadership group, a decision-making committee, something with responsibility, it's going to be at least 50% women. It can be more, that's okay. Every time that there's speakers going out, they're going to be at least half women. It can be more, that's okay, but not less than half. Every time that there's a talk about the war, there is going to be discussion of patriarchy and of sexism, and it is not going to be tacked on, right? Like a penance. It's going to be an organic part of what is discussed. And if we don't do these things, and also rectify our behavior inside the organization, there's simply going to be no anti-war movement. The men didn't all stand up and applaud. They didn't all say, okay, you're right. Men tried to retain the positions that they had. And women fought for the changes that occurred. Is the battle completely won? No. But it is largely won. If we could teleport people back to 1968 or 1969, the women in the room, back to then, you may not remember, but you wouldn't last 2 days. You would just be screaming and berserk at the horror of it. There have been immense changes. There's way to go, more to go, but there have been immense changes. Now the same thing happened around race, with the same result. It was a different dynamic, because it was black power and so on, but it's the same message. So what am I driving at here? What I'm driving at is you can't have a movement that internally, just morally it's despicable, it's hypocritical, but it's also suicidal, strategically. To have a movement that denigrates, disempowers, disses, a constituency that is absolutely critical to what you're trying to do. But we've had that then, and we have it now, and we've had it every year in between regarding class. And it isn't even something that can be discussed. So, why do people not stick and leave? Why do some people never join in the first place? I think the third problem is a class problem. And it takes the following form. It's not that we have movements that are owned by somebody, right? We haven't replicated that aspect of capitalism. We don't have capitalists owning the movement, right? That's not the problem. The problem is different. Capitalism is a system which does indeed have about 2% of who are the real ruling class. But the other 98% isn't usefully viewed, I think, as one group of people. For me, it makes sense instead to see it as two groups. Let's skip the middle group for a minute. The bottom group is the working class. People whose work is unskilled, not so much unskilled, disempowering. They have a combination of responsibilities and tasks that are often rote, repetitive, but that in any case are disempowering. They don't convey to the person doing them the social skills and the confidence and the information that are necessary in order to be a powerful actor and to participate in decision making. On the other hand, there's about 20% who have a monopoly on those kinds of roles, right? Managers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, and so on. It's often called the middle class. That's just, obfuscation. There's nothing middle about the top 20%. And middle obscures the reason, right? There's always a middle. It's a way of obliterating what matters. What matters is that this constituency gets its power and its self-image and its understanding from its position in the economy monopolizing empowering tasks, monopolizing those empowering positions. And here's the claim regarding our movements. The claim is that our movements replicate the culture, the manners, and generally speaking, the aspirations of that 20%. not the working class and not classlessness. Now the thing is, in the United States, if you know working class people and have, or you are yourself, and you have good relations, or if by chance, in my case, you teach in schools that are full of working class people, or in prisons full of working class people, and you can establish a rapport, you discover something rather incredible, which is that when you talk about owners and capitalists, people will understand, people will relate, but there's no passion. Working class people don't feel passion. They don't get aroused about hating Bill Gates or even the owner of their firm, by and large. Why? They never encounter these people. They have no personal experience of them. These people are totally cloistered, far away. So there's no personal experience of those people. There's no sort of personal antipathy. It's just a structural one. But now if you talk to working people about lawyers, doctors, engineers, and managers, and it's an honest exchange, and people are revealing the way they feel, now the passion is there. And the passion is hatred. And the hatred is there because this constituency, not everybody in it, but on average, displays toward working people a kind of a paternalistic arrogance. Right? And the claim about the movement is that working class people can feel that our movements are not about them. Our movements are about that 20%. They're anti-owner, but they're not pro-worker. The most extreme instance of this is what's called Marxism-Leninism, which I think is the ideology of what I want to call the coordinator class. It generates a result, a system, right, whose institutions elevate the coordinator class to ruling status. Right? That's exactly what it does. That's exactly what the old Soviet Union was. It was a system in which the economy, in fact, had about 20% dominating 80%. For working people, that's their worst nightmare. That's not liberation. That's their worst nightmare. Many of you will remember Spiro Agnew. Right? Agnew, the buffoon, who was vice president of the United States. He was no buffoon. He was pretty clever.
Spiro Quail.
Huh? And what he was doing, this is a guy who, what was it? Effete intellectual snobs, right? And that's what he would call dissenters. He was trying to identify the movement with intellectuals, with professionals, with the coordinator class. He was trying to say to working people, to the bulk of the population, yeah, they have some good rhetoric, like Bill Clinton has good rhetoric and we dismiss it. He was saying to them, they have some good rhetoric, but really, they're the people you hate. And you don't want to be involved with them. And it was very effective. And the reason it was very effective is because there was a good deal of truth to it. Let me give you a depressing example of this. But I think an instructive one, and we have to face these things. You're Dick Cheney. You're Bin Laden. Bin. I guess that's not right. Osama. How could you do it? How could you do it? Now, if I ask him how he could do it, I think you'd understand the question. You'd understand that I meant, how could you kill thousands of people? And it could have been way more. Disrupt the lives of so many people. How could you do that? And I think he would answer, I understand there was tremendous suffering, but I felt that the outcome, the benefits, warranted that suffering. And for those who are interested, I think that if he then went on to say what he thought what the benefits were that he was seeking, they would be that the United States responds in a way that polarizes a swath of countries from Eastern Asia to Western Africa, elevating groups like the Taliban, fundamentalist groups, into much more prominence and even power. In other words, he got exactly what he was seeking. But in any case, he'd understand Dick or George. How could you do it? They wouldn't have, and now I'm referring not to knocking down the 2 buildings, but to bombing Afghanistan. And he wouldn't understand the question. You have to know something about Afghanistan to understand the magnitude of this question. In the period leading up to the bombing of Afghanistan, all of the aid groups and the food aid and the UN organizations and the Oxfam and all that stuff that were in Afghanistan were saying one thing. They weren't actually saying it. They were pleading. They were down on their knees. And they were saying to the United States, don't bomb. You can't bomb. Please don't bomb. Because if you bomb, 5 to 7 million people are going to starve to death. Right? The perception was that the result of American bombing, this is a population that's, the average lifespan is, 43, a third of the population is literate, and so on and so forth. The perception was, if we bombed, it's not so much the people who are going to die from the shrapnel, and that's bad enough, but the disruption of the growing season would lead to incredible horror and death. And it wasn't contested, right? That was the general belief. It doesn't matter whether it happened or not. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if 1 million or 2 million people did die. Nobody bothers to count, right? Nobody bothers to look and see. So I wouldn't be too surprised if that was the case. We don't know. But in any case, the point is that before the fact, it was the belief. So when you ask, how can you do it? That's part of the equation, right? How could you do it? Thinking that that might be the outcome, or would be the outcome. I don't think he'd understand the question. And the reason he wouldn't understand the question is because he wouldn't see that there was any cost. He wouldn't understand that there was something weighing against, showing the world that we were tough. That's the virtue, right? That's the benefit. He wouldn't understand that there was a downside. If we had a little camera on the wall in the war room when they were deciding whether or not to bomb, and they were talking about it, going around with their relative concerns and so on, it's not that I don't think that they would have spent a week talking about the impact on the Afghan citizens, or a day, or a few hours, or an hour, or 10 minutes, or 1 minute, or 5 seconds. I don't think they talked about it for a millisecond. I don't think it came up. I don't even think it was, it existed as a thing, right? For them, the pain to Afghan citizens is like, for you, walking out your door and you might step on an ant. You don't calculate where you're going to walk to avoid the ant that might be there. And they don't calculate their bombing to avoid the Afghan population, even starving 5 million of them. So that's America. And now what's the purpose of this story in the class discussion that I was having? Now's when it gets really... And during the No Nukes movement, we had this massive movement. And for those of you who remember, you'll remember, and for those of you who don't, I'll tell you, the No Nukes movement in the United States was huge. So there was a demonstration in New York City that, 750,000 people. But there were civil disobedience demonstrations at reactors around the country. We tore down fences with the barbed wire, rushed the reactor. There was a big movement, it was militant, and it was aggressive. But the movement did not appeal at all to working people, who, in fact, hated it. Now, a lot of people thought at the time, and said at the time, the reason that they hate it is because they're so narrow-minded, they think it's anti-jobs, and they're only out for themselves. Notice the disparaging, arrogant way of trying to understand other people's views. The first thing that's wrong with this interpretation is that it is incredibly stupid. Nuclear reactors, of course, are about the least job-intensive institutions that there could be. Getting rid of nuclear reactors does not reduce jobs, it increases jobs, right? So it's utter nonsense. But the real issue is, did it ever occur to the No Nukes movement, beyond a very few people, to ask, what's the effect of cutting back on nuclear power? Where does the energy come from? if we don't produce it with nuclear reactors? Well, in the world we live in, it's coal. And it's coal mining. And it's black lung disease. And the issue here is no nukes the right demand. The issue here is the possibility of a calamitous meltdown so horrible that we have to not have nukes even at the expense of having more coal mining. That's probably the case. But the issue is not thinking about it. What do I mean? If you look at our institutions, they're organized in the same way that capitalist institutions are organized. There's no owner, but there's the big fundraiser or the big donor. And that person has the biggest corner office every time, right? And then there's the exact same structure. There's a set of people, executive directors and boards and heads and managers, and a hierarchy that is just like the hierarchy that exists in a corporation, in which about 20% have all the empowering work and 80% are running around doing their bidding. And workers can see that and can see the hypocrisy. And when they ask what you're for, what are you for, it's a fair question, because it looks like what we're for is the same crap that they endure every day. And they don't want to endure it. Just like for women, the movement when it was grossly sexist was more oppressive than the world outside. Why? Because in the world outside, nobody was running around saying we're great, we're humane. But in the movement, we're all running around saying we're great, we're humane, clean up after me. We're about classlessness, we're about getting rid of poverty. Go stack the books, right? Go be the, and I'll be the editor. People can see this. So we have the stickiness problem, we have the vision problem, and we have what I think is the class problem. It takes more forms than this. Let me give you another example. There's a million examples, actually, if you start to think about it and you become sensitized to it. So, there's some funny ones. How many of you read the New York Times? A lot. And if you don't read the New York Times, you read some paper from Minneapolis or whatever that is supposed to be like the New York Times. So, we criticize the New York Times, right? We rightly. We explain why it's one of the most despicable institutions on the face of the planet. What does it do? I mean, for those who aren't aware, the New York Times is history. The New York Times is the documentary record of what goes on in the world, right? All scholars use the New York Times as the basis of knowing what has occurred. So the New York Times is the archival record of history. The banner of the New York Times says what? We print all the news that's fit to print. In other words, all the news that's consistent with the interests of owners and coordinator class with elites. That's what it means. And that's what they do. Or they spin it. And they do it so that the historical record will be what they want it to be. And in fact, actually, it's quite fascinating. Every once in a while, something sneaks into the morning edition of the New York Times that shouldn't be there. But it disappears by the time the late evening edition happens, which becomes the archival record. The working class person reads the equivalent of the Daily News, right? The tabloid paper. What do they read in that? What's the main thing that they read in that each day? Sports section. The only part of the paper that tells the truth. They're idiots, and we're geniuses. The movement gets apoplectic about McDonald's, but not about fancy restaurants. They both employ wage slaves. Right? I mean, what is it about McDonald's that's so offensive? That the food is cheap? It's incredible. That's the only thing about the place that's any good. But that's the distinguishing feature that you have to think. But let me give you one that's sort of sharp. I'm in State College, Pennsylvania. Some of you may have heard this before. I use this example a lot because it's pretty graphic. I'm at a conference of leftists. There's about 400 people in a room like this. And we're warming up for me to speak, and I'm sort of chatting with the audience, beforehand. State College, Pennsylvania is where Joe Paterno. How many people have heard of Joe Paterno? Okay, that's like asking how many people have heard of George Washington. in the United States. If you haven't heard of, everybody in the working class has heard of Joe Paterno. Every single person in the working class knows who Joe Paterno is. All right, two don't. But in any case, he's a football coach in State College, Pennsylvania, and one of the premier college football coaches in the United States. So it's a football town. It's a town in which there's about 60,000 people, and there's 60 or 70,000 seats in a stadium. And every Sunday when they play there, the whole place is full and the whole town is empty. Everything revolves around football. And so I say to people, how many of you have been to a football game? Now this is an audience of all leftists. It's a big school. And 3 hands go up. That is about 400 people. And the 3 hands that go up are black. And there's 3 black people in the room. And that's probably the last time they've ever been in the left meeting. And everybody's laughing. Everybody thinks it's cute. Everybody thinks I'm sort of with them. We're superior. We don't fall for that rot. We don't go to the football game. We're better than that. So then I said, on the way from the motel where I was staying to this talk, I went past a sports bar. It's a big bar, big social hangout. And I look in the window, and now, this is true, it's daunting. The people in there are big. They're big. They really are big. You look in and there's a shitload of people who look like 2 people. They're big. They are large. I don't mean overweight, I mean big. And it's huge. There's tons of people in there. And so the second question I asked them is, how many of you have gone into the sports bar that I passed on my way over here, and have sat down with folks, and have talked about, whatever it is that you're most concerned about, poverty or war or sexism or whatever. And now they're rolling in the aisles laughing. Right? I mean, literally. They're just in hysterics. And they think I'm with them. And then we have a turn in the mood. Because I don't know how to say this that isn't blunt and harsh. I know you think that you're all leftists. I know that you think you're all about making a better world. But you're not. You're not about that. You're about something else. Because you can't be on a campus where football is blood. Football is everybody, and you exude a dismissiveness toward football. It's like being an organizer in France and saying to speak French is to be a schnook. It's to be pathetic. It's about on that scale, right? But it's true. Now, do they have the same reaction to tennis? No. Do they have the same reaction to skating? No. Do they have the same reaction to NASCAR? Yes. Do they have the same reaction to bowling? Yes. And what's the common feature of what's dismissed by the left and what's accepted by the left? I hope you can see. And so we talk about it. And I think when the women said you have to clean up your act, and the black community said you have to clean up your act, they were both right. And when they both said it's suicidal to have Jim Crow racism inside your movement, to have a movement that's like the Playboy Club, they were right. And we don't understand why we don't win, why we aren't bigger than we are. But we have that fault around class. Now, something a little more intellectual, I suppose. Why do we have that fault around class? It isn't just, but it is partly, that it's our training and our interests. And we have to face that. It is partly that. It's partly who we are and what we know. But it's something more. When I got involved in the movement, because of the war and civil rights and so on, you went very quickly from that to Marxism and to Marxism-Leninism. Because that was the intellectual framework. That was a toolbox where you could get what you needed. Right? You could get concepts and tools that explain things, that could give you an identity, and so on. And class was predominant. I spent a large part of my political life arguing against the excessive focus on class and economics, and for the incorporation of concepts around gender and race and political power on an equal level. But something happened when women came along and fought, and blacks came along and fought, something profound happened, which I only understood, and this is a bit of an idiosyncratic view, not everybody's going to agree with this, unlike everything else I've said. They said, there's a system, but there's also the manifestation of that system in us, in our interpersonal relations. And to deal with racism and to deal with sexism, we have to deal with the institutional elements of those, and we also have to deal with the way they have infected our own operations and our own behavior. And we have to look at what you might call the hidden injuries or the private dynamics of race and gender. And when that got on the table, if class stayed on the table, if class remained prominent, instead of just a sort of a buzzword for capitalists, then we'd have to look seriously at the dynamics of class. We'd have to look seriously at the nuts and bolts of it. And if we looked at that, we would see the coordinated class, working class distinction. We would see that dynamic, the dynamic between doctors and working class patients, the dynamic between managers and workers, and so on. And I would contend that the reason, there's often a discussion on the left, why did class decline in importance in the left? And some people will blame it on women, blame it on blacks. They pushed it off the agenda. That's crap, right? Saying that gender is important doesn't mean you're saying class is unimportant. Saying that race is important doesn't mean you're saying race and class is unimportant. I think the people who pushed it off the agenda were the people who previously said it was most important. In a very subtle way, I think that it was necessary to downgrade the attention to class, because if we paid attention to it, we would have to pay attention to this coordinated class, working class dynamic. And so we had to not do that. We had to stop talking about it so much. We had to not feature it so much, except rhetorically, except capitalists. You see what I'm saying? And so we have yet to address it. We understand it around race and gender, but we don't get it around class. So a big part of my life and a big part of what goes on in the book is trying to find experiences, people, interactions, events, etc., like some of the ones I've mentioned and many more, that get at what it is that keeps us from being as effective as we need to be. And that maybe point toward how we can do better. That's one big part of it. And another big part of it is talking about efforts to do that and ideas that are related to it and things like vision and so on. Now, I can ramble on forever, and I will if nobody says anything. But I'm going to open up instead and see if there are things that people want to hear about specifically. And if so, I'll react to them. But I will answer at some length. I hate short answers. What?